Well, hello everyone. My name is Jennifer Docktor, and I'm a faculty member in the physics department at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak with your group today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the Q&A session. So the title of my talk looks suspiciously like a book that I just published with my co-author Jose Mestre. So he recently retired from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and prior to that he was also at UMass Amherst. And so some of the things that we give as examples of research studies in the book are based on things that he did at both of those institutions. And I was a postdoc with him from 2009 to 2011. So this was a 2-year project that we worked on, Science of Learning Physics, and it just came out from the publisher in December. So you can find it on the World Scientific Publishing Company website or on Amazon if you're interested. So part of the reason that we wrote this book is a little bit of frustration that we've been in physics education research for a while. And what we've noticed as faculty at teaching physics at the college level is that a lot of things we know about physics education research aren't being utilized at the college level. And so there are a lot of reasons for that, I guess, and people are studying why it isn't being used more. But maybe having another resource out there might help people decide to start using some of these ideas. So the book is structured to include different sections, like we highlight examples of research from not just physics education fields, but from cognitive psychology, education psychology, the learning sciences. And then we have a section that is just on what we feel are some of the instructional implications of that research. And then we try to give some concrete examples of what you could actually do in a classroom to apply some of those research findings. So I've highlighted the word DBER here because Jose and I also collaborated on a more scholarly article back in 2014. It's in the Physical Review Physics Education Journal called A Synthesis of Discipline-Based Education Research in Physics. And so that article is a little bit more what I would call scholarly or formal. And the book, we tried to make a little bit more informal with some of our anecdotes and ideas. So hopefully it's a little bit easier to read. So in this talk, I want to kind of highlight some of the things we found as we were researching for this book. And as I was typing up the chapter titles, I realized we wrote really long chapter titles. So I highlighted some of these keywords here. So you'll notice that some of these first chapters are probably familiar if you know a little bit about physics education research. And so the field of physics education research is getting to be 40 years old now. It began in the late 70s, early 80s, and it started a lot with research on conceptual difficulties that students had learning physics. And so we have a chapter that talks a little bit about that. And then also on problem solving, which is another area that was kind of a starting point for physics education research. And chapter 3 in between there has some overlap with both of those. So a lot of the research that was done at the beginning was based on how experts think about physics and solving physics problems, and also how novices or beginning students, people who aren't as experienced in the field of physics, think about it. And then that resulted in a lot of curricular development and things like interactive engagement techniques, active learning strategies to help address those conceptual difficulties and issues with problem solving that we saw in our classrooms. So that's kind of chapters 2 through 5 really are more based on physics education research, but also might have a little bit of a cognitive slant to them too. Chapters 6 and 7, and hopefully I'll have some time to talk a little bit more about those. Those are based more on psychology research that I don't think has quite made its way into discipline-based education research yet. And so I learned a lot about what students have as perceptions of their own learning and what they believe will help their learning, which actually doesn't help their learning, and some of their study habits which are more effective, ones that aren't as effective. So I'll try and spend a little bit more time on that. And the testing effects ties in directly to some of those perceptions and study habits too. We tossed around the idea of having an 8th chapter that was more about non-cognitive aspects related to learning, like motivational issues, self-efficacy, maybe gender differences that we've seen in physics. But we just kind of decided that we couldn't do it justice in this book, and we don't know as much about those areas. So we ended up leaving it out, but we do recognize that those issues also play a big role in learning physics. All right, so if you're a physics teacher or a physics instructor, you probably told people what you do, and you get one of 2 or 3 reactions. You get, oh, I loved my physics class in high school. That rarely happens to me. Or you get someone saying like, oh, physics was so hard, I hated it. Or you must be really smart to be a physics teacher. So I think that, why is it that we get these reactions? Why is it that students feel like physics is such a difficult thing to learn? One of the reasons that we know from research is that students have, even people in general, not just our students, they have ideas about how the world works, and based on their observations and their experiences. And many of those ideas are inconsistent with the way that scientists think about how the world works, or the physics explanation for how things works. And one of the most common examples is this idea that a lot of people believe heavier objects fall faster, which is not true. But in your everyday experience, if you drop a hammer and you drop a feather, chances are the hammer is going to hit the ground first. But if you show your students a video, the astronauts go up to the moon and they do it, they'll hit the ground at the same time. And so, that's, maybe that will help change their ideas, but people have these beliefs that are very hard to change. Newton's third law is another big one, that idea that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, or things that exert equal and opposite forces on each other. So if you have a really heavy truck and it's colliding with a smaller car, that they exert equal and opposite forces on each other. That's really hard to change students' ideas about it, because it runs so counterintuitive to what they've seen in their everyday experience. So that's one reason why it's difficult to learn physics. The other reason that I have on here is maybe partly our fault. So there's this phenomenon called the expert blind spot. And so once we as instructors know a lot about physics, and we've been doing it for a while, it becomes really hard for us to put ourselves back in that position of being someone who doesn't know physics or is learning it for the first time. And so putting ourselves back in the shoes of our students or of a novice can be really hard to do. And so one example is if your students are trying to work on a problem and they say like, well, I just don't even know where to start. And for us, that might be really hard to grasp, because we can look at it and say, well, obviously you just apply conservation of energy or something. So for us, it's really obvious, but for our students, it's not really obvious how to proceed on that. But I'll talk about in here how you can sort of guide students to have some ways of dealing with that. Like maybe draw a picture, write down what you're given, think about the concepts and principles involved. But it can be really hard for us to break down the processes that we're using because they've become so tacit. All right, so I'm just going to highlight a few key things from each chapter. So the first one is on concept formation, and we know there's oodles and oodles of research in physics education about difficulties that students have learning particular concepts in physics. And so we know that students are not coming to us as blank slates. They have existing ideas or prior knowledge about how the world works. And there was a video series back in the 90s when I was going through a teacher preparation program from Annenberg Media, Private Universe, and also like Minds of Our Own. So there's I think a lot of the ideas that came up in that video series are still relevant today. Students are constructing their own understandings of what's going on in the world, and these ideas can be very difficult to change. I took a whole class in graduate school on conceptual change theory. And so, and there are a lot of different theories that people have related to a conceptual understanding. But the key implication, I think, of this research is that we need to find out where our students are at. And so we need to be asking them what they think to share their knowledge, and there are different ways that you can elicit that knowledge. So one of the resources that I've come to really enjoy is Paige Keeley's work. She has a book that's just 75 science formative assessment classroom techniques, things like think, pair, share, or writing a muddiest point, different things that you can do in your classroom, not just to elicit students' ideas, but also to kind of gauge where they're at, maybe towards the end of a class too. So they're called, a lot of that she has, they're called misconception probes. And sometimes these ideas that students have are called misconceptions, sometimes alternative conceptions or naive conceptions. But the book series on uncovering student ideas in science are based on middle school research and also high school information. And so those books are really good because they talk about the research findings and then give you some examples of probes you could use, where a lot of them are multiple choice questions where the distractors are based on common ideas that people have. And I've used a lot of these in my classroom. I teach a class that's physical science for future elementary school teachers, and so these have been really useful there too. Things like one probe that I've used a lot is which of these materials will stick to a magnet? And almost always, like a lot of students at the beginning of the semester will say, all metals will stick to a magnet. And then we do some experiments and we see, oh no, like aluminum foil, magnet doesn't stick to that. It doesn't stick to copper pipes. But even when I ask them again at the end of class, at the end of the semester, at least a third of my students will still tell me that all metals will stick to a magnet. And so it just shows me how important some of this research is and how critical it is to really try and address students' conceptual understanding and ideas in the classroom. And some of these resources can really help you with doing that. So I kind of mentioned how expert novice research was an early part of physics education research, and it kind of overlaps with both the conceptual chapter and the problem solving chapter. But if you've read any of that or are familiar with that, the studies found that there are differences in the way that more experienced physicists structure their knowledge and memory, and also the way that they approach the problem solving. And so they did some of these studies on categorization where they had problems written on little index cards and people had to place them into piles or classify them in some way. And the experts that they were studying would classify them based on the concepts and principles that you would use to actually solve the problems, whereas more inexperienced novices would classify them based on surface level features like, oh, this is an inclined plane problem, has springs in it, pulleys. I did a follow-up study with Jose at Illinois, and we found that they also sometimes talked about the quantities in the problems, like velocity or acceleration, and we're using those to classify the problems. But then we also see that this carries over into problem solving. And so students often will use a very haphazard or disconnected approach to problem solving. They're kind of looking for equations, hunting for equations that will have some of the quantities in them that are listed in the problem. They aren't always thinking about the bigger picture in terms of the concepts and principles. So as an instructor, what can you do to try and emphasize that more and really elevating the role of concepts and principles in your class is important. So one idea is to give them practice with categorization. Jose had a study called the HAT study. He had a computer program that was a hierarchical analyzation tool or something. So the students would see a physics problem and they had to click a button of like, what kind of key principles and concepts would be used to solve that problem. So getting them to think about that before they even go about solving it, trying to classify different problems. There's another way to assess categorization where maybe you have a problem statement, and then below it you have two problem statements, and you say which of these two would be solved most like this first problem. So there are different ways to practice that. Strategy writing is a technique where students write down the principle that, before they even solve the problem, they write down the principle they would use to solve it, a justification for why that principle is applicable to this particular problem, and then a plan for how they're going to apply it before they even start, writing out equations and things like that. Another idea is to help students organize their physics knowledge by things like a concept map. I've put a little picture on this slide, and maybe you do this in your classes too. You can kind of build up a concept map for students as you learn the different topics. What are some of the key ideas that you've learned about, starting with maybe kinematics or forces, whatever you start with? How does that connect to energy and momentum? So you kind of build up these ideas, and even as a poster or something on, in your classroom that they can refer back to, and when they're thinking about how to solve a problem, what is the key concept or principle that applies here? And even the way that we model how to solve problems is really important in a class, and trying to make those steps that you just do automatically, trying to make them more explicit while you're solving a problem for students. So I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and their physics education group there really emphasizes problem solving strategies and things like that. So I feel like this is one of my areas of expertise, and I did write this chapter in the book. But what we know about problem solving is that there are differences. There are expert novice differences that I mentioned before. And experts will often do kind of a low-level qualitative analysis of a problem before jumping into equations, where they think about the concepts and principles that apply. But in addition to that, they are also able to monitor their progress as they're working through a problem. If things don't seem like they're making sense or working right, they'll cycle back and try a different strategy. At the end, they'll have some strategies to look at whether or not their final answer makes sense, maybe looking at limiting cases or analyzing the units, things like that. And so physics education research has a lot of instructional materials for teaching problem solving. There are a lot of different types of problems. Minnesota likes to use context-rich problems. So instead of just having like your classic box on an incline plane, maybe you have some movers who are trying to, push a crate up an incline or something like that, giving it some context. But in our book, and also in that synthesis paper, we talk about some different kinds of problem types. You can also use a framework with your students, have them explicitly draw out a picture, have them describe what approach they're going to use, some diagrams, writing out the equations and symbols before they start plugging in numbers, or planning their solution before they actually plug in the numbers too. And so there are ways that you can help to structure that problem solving process for students. When you're maybe doing an example with students in class, you can certainly model the productive behaviors that you want to see them actually do when they're solving problems, and so making sure that you also are showing all your steps, not shortcutting the process, so that students are also going to engage in those productive behaviors. There are a lot of different ways to assess problem solving too. So you want it to be consistent with the way that you modeled it for them and the way that you're emphasizing things in your class. You could use rubrics. I developed one when I was at the University of Minnesota called the Minnesota Assessment of Problem Solving MAPS rubric. But there's also ways that you can assess problem solving with things like giving them a solution to a problem that contains an error, and the students have to find the error. And so that's a very high level task. We tried some of that in studies we did with high schools when I was at the University of Illinois, and very few people could actually find the conceptual errors in those questions. So it's a very high level task, something that you could certainly try with students. All right, so active learning is one of those things where everybody uses that word, but what does it really mean? So in physics, I feel like it's a term that's used to mean anything that's not traditional passive instruction. So if you're just lecturing in front of a group of students and they're trying to write down what you say, I would call that traditional instruction. And anything that's more active than that is oftentimes called interactive engagement techniques or active learning strategies. But it could have, this word can have different meanings depending on your discipline, or even people in psychology, I think, sometimes define this differently than what we do in physics. But the key idea is that students can't just be watching the show. And I know that we love doing demos and impressing people and how cool is physics, but they actually need to be actively participating in the process. And it doesn't mean that they have to be doing hands-on lab activities. They could also be cognitively engaged. And so they could be thinking about what they're learning, maybe using a classroom polling technology like a clicker, or if you're teaching high school and you're in virtual learning, maybe you're using other polling technologies, Kahoot or some other kind of system, so that you can gauge where students are at and get them to participate a little bit more in the process. So there are some people who have tried to define what are the characteristics of active learning instruction. And some of the key ones are that students have to have the opportunity to share their ideas and the justifications for those ideas or their reasoning. Oftentimes this happens in small groups, either with another student as a pair, or in maybe a group of 3 or 4. So collaborative learning and cooperative learning is a big active learning strategy. And you also want to encourage, as part of active learning, you want to encourage students to be figuring things out on their own, constructing their own knowledge and making sense of it. So those are some of the key, these might not be as concrete examples, but some things to think about with active learning. And the physics education community has a lot of curricula that have come out that are based on encouraging more interactive engagement in your classes. Things like interactive lecture demonstrations, tutorials in introductory physics, and lots of different curricula that you can use. All right, so I really wanted to talk a little bit more about chapter 6 in the book, because this is where I learned some information that I didn't know before. So there have been some studies recently about student perceptions, and when students sit in a lecture, they perceive that they are learning more. And so if you ask them, how much do you think you learned after sitting through this lecture, they will rate that they learned more than they learn if they're doing some kind of active learning activity. Maybe they're working with a group of students on something in the class. But if you measure their actual learning, giving them some like pre-post assessments, they're actually learning less from the lecture, even though they would say that they learned more. So this presents some challenges, I think, for us as instructors. Another thing that's really interesting is there's been some research on common study strategies that students use. And so a lot of this is by John Dunlosky. And this is article, I think, in the American Educator. It's written more colloquially to be sort of for instructors. There's also a longer article in the journal Psychological Science in the public interest, where they go through several different study strategies and which ones are more effective in terms of research findings, which ones are sort of promising but don't have a lot of research backing, and which ones are really not particularly useful. They don't go as far as saying they're ineffective, but not really having evidence to support them. So they go through at least 10 different strategies. And so you'll see the most effective ones that they talk about are like practice testing. So students have to frequently kind of test their knowledge in order to see if they really understand it or not. The idea of distributed practice is that you're spacing out your learning over time. It's in comparison to what we call massed practice. Massed practice is like cramming. And so we know students do it and they know that they're just trying to pass a test or something like that. And so maybe that is effective for them in the short term, but it isn't promoting long-term learning and transfer to new situations. And so mass practice, we should encourage students not to just cram. You'll be able to retain the information better if you space your learning out over time and practice testing yourself. So there are different ways, some strategies here that are kind of promising. There isn't a whole lot of research in support of them, but they're promising. Interleaved practice has to do with kind of combining multiple topics or ideas when you're practicing. So I like to think of this in physics as like maybe you're not just going chapter by chapter and saying like, oh, I know how to solve these problems because they all have to do with linear kinematics in one dimension, or I know all of these problems have to do with Newton's laws of motion. I'm not going to see anything, from a previous chapter or something like that. So interleaved is like maybe you have a combination of principles. It's like having a cumulative exam. You're kind of intermixing things so that students have to be able to identify which principles should I use here and practice knowing what conditions have to be in place in order to apply a particular principle. And that's better for long-term learning than just kind of segmenting things. Elaborative interrogation and self-explanation kind of have to do with when you're reading something in a textbook or in your notes, kind of asking yourself, well, why, or how does that connect to things that I already know? I'm trying to explain it in your own words, just really thinking about it more deeply. So contrary to popular belief from our students, just highlighting the textbook or your notes or underlining things doesn't really help your learning. It might make you, we call it like it's a feel-good strategy. It makes you feel like you're more familiar with the material, that you're doing something when you're studying, but really, if you've ever looked at a textbook that students highlight, they highlight way too much. They have difficulty picking out what the important information is. And so it can be a starting point, but it's not really the most effective strategy. Also, just rereading the textbook or their notes isn't necessarily the best strategy either. You need to be actively engaging in that rereading process, maybe with the elaborative interrogation or self-explanation pieces to it. Just summarizing something, a summarization isn't necessarily a useful practice either, unless people are explicitly trained on how to summarize something and maybe think more deeply about what they've read. I already kind of mentioned mass practice, so just trying to cram everything in a short amount of time, studying the same thing over and over and over again can be effective in the short term, but if you're looking at long-term learning, it's not very effective. And then some of these other strategies like keyword mnemonics or trying to use imagery with the text, trying to imagine things in terms of pictures or use, like ways to help you remember vocabulary or things like that. Might also be effective in the short term, but it doesn't always stick. All right, and then I also wanted to mention that as we're learning about perceptions and study strategies, there's a researcher named Bjork at UCLA, and he's really kind of summarized this as you need to have desirable difficulties. And so some of these, strategies that are less useful are pretty low-level things for students to do. They don't require a lot of thought, and that's the problem. In order to really learn something, you have to put in some effort. And so in the mathematics field, I think sometimes this is called productive struggle. And so students need to have a little bit of struggle with the material. You can't just always jump in and tell them the answer. If you have these desirable difficulties, it'll promote learning. So in that student toolbox article that Dunlosky wrote, he identifies some tips for instructors. And so I've tried to summarize these tips here, but they're largely from that article. And so how can you encourage, that practice testing? You can give more formatives or low stakes quizzes, asking students to continuously review the material, practice the material in your classes. You can encourage students to develop good study habits. What's your plan? When are you going to study for the exam? Start a week in advance and budget time in order to do that. You can also give some more, cumulative types of problems or exams that combine multiple topics and principles so that they're not just learning things in a very segmented way, but they have to think about the bigger picture of physics and what's involved. You can encourage students to be reading things actively, questioning themselves, like, what did I just read about? How does that connect to what I've learned before? What does this mean in my own words? Not just passively reading things. And having them ask why, why, and does this make sense? So mixing this idea of interleave practice to mixing content, old content with new content. And then, you can make students aware of some of these study strategies, which ones are effective, which ones are not as effective or not as useful, and tell them it's okay if you highlight. Just be aware that that's only the beginning. Like it may not be actually the most effective way to promote your learning of the material. So the testing effect is kind of related to what I was talking about on the previous slide about study strategies. But this research has shown that people who study something initially and then are tested have a greater long-term retention of the material than if a group of people were just studying the whole time. So that, and even if the people who were tested didn't get feedback on whether or not their answers were correct, just the process of testing yourself promoted long-term retention of the material. And so there's been several studies of this in the psychology field with like learning words and a series of words and stuff like that. I think it's just starting to make its way into more content-based areas of research. I haven't really seen much in physics education yet, but I think it will be something that people kind of jump on and test out soon. The other thing that comes out of this research on the testing effect is that the way that you test or the information that you're testing to can make a difference. And so this probably isn't a surprise to someone who's been teaching for a while, but if you are requiring students to generate some knowledge or a short answer response, give you some indication of what they're thinking or justifying their understanding, that is going to promote more long-lasting learning than if you're just requiring them to recognize something or identify something from a list, that kind of lower level recall stuff. And so the instructional strategies, I talked about a lot of these in the Dunlosky tips and stuff, like maybe you do frequent testing or formatives, your practice, having them do practice testing, maybe some cumulative types of exams or problem solving so that they can be doing some practice with the material so that they're actually testing themselves and taking it seriously, and not just sort of rereading things and developing a sense of familiarity with the material. All right, so in the book, we have a few concluding remarks. And I didn't go into detail about everything in the book, but one thing that we also talk about is some of the challenges of implementing ideas in terms of reformed instruction. And in the book, we call these evidence-based instructional practices, or EBIPs. You can also call them like RBIS, research-based instructional strategies, especially at the college level. Sometimes there are situational factors that affect whether or not, somebody will try out a new way of teaching in their classroom. And there's a lot of, inertia to just keep doing what you're doing or to keep doing things more traditionally. And so we need to change that culture. We need to be supportive of people who want to try new things in their classroom. And we need to be basing our teaching on evidence of what works for student learning. So my second point here is that teaching really is a scholarly activity. Certainly as you become more experienced in your teaching, you have anecdotal things that work for you. And some people say teaching is an art, but really you should be starting with what we know as evidence of student learning. What are some of the things that will be most effective for student learning? Try some of those out in your classroom, and then treat this as a scholarly activity, scholarship of teaching and learning. Collect data on whether or not that was effective in your situation. And don't just try it once, because sometimes it takes a few times, but collect data with regard to student learning in your class, and then refine the process. Maybe that didn't work as well as you thought it would. Try out a different strategy. And hopefully, I've given you a few ideas today, but also certainly in the book, we review some instructional strategies that are based on physics education research, but also psychology, the learning sciences, education psychology. And so we can draw from a lot of different areas about what we know about student learning, but ultimately this is something that should be based on research.